So good morning, governors, Dr. Altavilla, and dear guests. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the 7th edition of the annual research workshop of the Central Bank of Malta. This year the workshop has a little bit different format with respect to the past, so we wanted to have some presentation of all the articles that are in our research bulletin, and actually this is the event that launches the research bulletin of the bank. I'll just give you a little bit of an outline of how the day is going to work out. So after this introduction, there will be Governor De Marco that is going to deliver his opening remarks, and he will launching the remarks from Governor De Marco. There will be 4 presentations that are in the article, which are the articles presented, published in our research bulletin. After a coffee break, our guest and keynote speaker, Carlo Altavilla from the ECB, will deliver his speech, and following that will be lunch. After lunch, there will be 2 presentations from other research projects that are ongoing in our research department, and after that there will be a networking session with some drinks. Before we start, a few housekeeping guidelines. On the desk, you will have QR codes for both the program and the research bulletin. So with your phone, your devices, you can download the research bulletin. The event is going to be recorded, and pictures will be taken by our staff, and will be published in our website. After every presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So if people from the room would like to ask questions, please raise your hand, and they will be given you a microphone. And please state your name and your affiliation, and then pose your question, and the presenter will answer it. To the presenters, there will be signs with countdown minutes, 5, 10, 2, and 1 minute, so that we can try to keep our schedule as tight as possible. And finally, please put your mobile phones in silent mode so that the workshop can go smoothly. Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Governor De Marco for his opening remarks.
So, good morning to everybody, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and honored guests. Welcome to the Central Bank of Malta's annual research workshop. I believe this is the 7th edition of this event. And this event offers a valuable opportunity to share insights on various topical issues on the economic research agenda, and present our latest production of the research bulletin. Today's event underscores the importance of rigorous policy-relevant research in supporting decision-making with a view of achieving economic stability and resilience. Through both empirical and theoretical work, we gain a better understanding of the evolving economic circumstances, improve our preparedness for shocks, which time and again they come, and strengthen our policy responses to an increasingly complex environment. This year's research bulletin features 4 articles that address priority areas for Malta's economy. The first article examines the extension of the EU emissions trading system to maritime transport, exploring its potential impacts on Maltese imports and the broader economic consequences. Given Malta's high degree of openness and significant reliance on imports, this analysis is critical as we consider the balance between environmental objectives and economic priorities. The second article focuses on the impact of climate change mitigation on Maltese firms, drawing on survey data to assess how local businesses are responding to these new environmental demands. This survey offers valuable insights into the resilience and adaptability of our business sector, while also helping us understand where support may be needed as firms adapt to a low-carbon economy. Our third article discusses the re-estimation of STREAM, the bank's macroeconometric model. STREAM is a cornerstone for our projections and policy simulations. As you know, the bank twice a year participates into the broad macroeconomic projection exercise of the Euro system, where each NCB contributes to the projections, to the macroeconomic projections, and these are consolidated for the Euro area, so it's a very important piece of work. By re-estimating and refining the model, we ensure that it continues to represent a reliable representation of the Maltese economy, to equip the bank in making well-informed decisions as conditions evolve. Finally, we present analysis of Malta's fixed energy price policy using a DSG model to shed light on the broader economic effects of this policy. Energy prices affect both households and businesses, and this study offers critical insights into how such a policy impacts resilience and stability over the longer term. For this event, we are also honored to welcome Dr. Carlo Altavilla, Head of the Monetary Analysis Division at the European Central Bank, as our keynote speaker today. Dr. Altavilla will address this audience, and his topic is banks' reluctance to intermediate, loan deficit, credit and quantitative easing. This is a timely presentation which will examine the role of banks in credit provision and the impact of monetary policy on lending conditions. Specifically, Dr. Altavilla will explore how unconventional policy tools such as credit easing and quantitative easing help align banks' incentives with economy-wide incentives, especially during times of financial stress. Additionally, I would like to highlight two ongoing projects that have been undertaken by the bank's economic division. The first examines the transmission of Eurozone monetary tightening to mortgage rates in Malta, using a study of bank-level data in a panel setting. This work aims to shed light on how our banking system responds, I would say uniquely, to monetary tightening in the Eurozone, a topic of particular relevance as interest rates in the last couple of years have risen across the region. Now we are dialing back a bit monetary policy in the last few months, but certainly this is a very important topic for us as a central bank in our analysis. The second project investigates the impact of wealth transfers on home ownership in Malta, utilizing data from the Household Finance and Consumption Survey. Wealth transfer is a significant factor influencing home ownership patterns and has important implications for social and economic policy. This research will provide insights into how intergenerational wealth transfers are shaping home ownership and housing affordability in Malta. In closing, I would like to thank each of you for being part of today's event, and I hope that there will be also a good discussion. This workshop represents a celebration of collaboration and knowledge sharing as we deepen our understanding of Malta's economic landscape. Through collective efforts and rigorous analysis, our goal is to be better placed in identifying those policies that strengthen Malta's resilience and prepare ourselves for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to an insightful and fruitful workshop today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor De Marco, for your intervention. And now we start our first session with the 4 presentations that are in the publication of the research bulletin. So now I invite my colleague Nathaniel De Bono to the podium to deliver his presentation, the extension of the EU emission trading system to maritime transport, implication for Maltese imports and wider ramification, which is a joint work with our other colleague Noel Rapa.
Thank you, Massimo. Good morning, everyone, first of all. So today, as Massimo said, I'll be presenting this work that we've been doing for the past few months now about the extension of the European Union emissions trading system to maritime transport and its implications for Maltese imports and other wider economic ramifications. This is joint work with Noel Rapa, also from the research department. And the usual disclaimer applies, so anything I'll say is our own views and not necessarily those of the bank. So, to start with a bit of a background to the emissions trading system, or ETS as I refer to it throughout the presentation, it is a key tool for the EU to meet its climate targets. Basically, it works in a way that it enforces the polluter pays principle. So essentially, the subjects which fall underneath the scope of the system, they basically have to compensate for their emissions. It is not a new system, it's been in place since 2005, but over time it has evolved in a number of ways. The most recent reform to it has seen it being extended to include also the emissions from maritime transport. So as of 1st January of 2024, now all the cargo and passenger ships of over 5,000 gross tons, which basically are all the cargo ships that you can think of, they basically have been drafted into the system. So they have to now compensate also for their emissions. The reform is route-based and flag-neutral, meaning that irrespective of the nationality of the ship, for every trip between 2 EU ports, the system covers 100% of the emissions. So the shipping companies basically have to report 100% of these emissions. For trips between an EU port and a non-EU port, it's 50%, which are covered. For trips between 2 non-EU ports, the system basically does not apply because the EU does not have any jurisdiction on either country. And the system also covers 100% of the emissions when the ships are within EU ports. Now, while the system is already in place, it was drafted in as from 1st January, it is following a gradual, it is being phased in gradually. So in 2024, shipping companies, they had to report their emissions based on this framework, based on these rules, but they only have to compensate 40% of these relevant emissions. In 2025, this will go up to 70%, and then the system will be fully in place in 2026, when all the relevant emissions will be captured. Now, of course, the idea behind this reform was purely environmental, right? It's a way for the EU to accelerate its drive towards meeting its climate targets, but there are potentially some important economic implications. For Malta, we identify 2 main ones. The first one is a potential implication in the sense of Malta's role as a transshipment hub in the Mediterranean. So we could see perhaps some transshipment traffic divert to nearby non-EU ports to avoid this ETS cost. The second one, and which is probably a more immediate risk, and the one we exclusively focus on in this paper, is a risk for higher commodity import prices. This may result if this extra ETS cost is passed through into higher freight shipping costs and eventually onto consumers and industry. As I said, the paper focuses exclusively on the second risk, and we assume throughout that the ETS cost is passed through fully to higher freight shipping costs and eventually to higher commodity prices. So the pass-through is full. It's a full pass-through. And for simplification reasons, we also only consider the potential effects once the system is fully in place as of 2026. So we assume that the relevant emissions, they will have to be 100% compensated. A brief word about the data that we use throughout the work. So we basically use 2 sources. The main one is this trade and transport data set, which has been developed by UNCTAD, which is very detailed because it contains annual bilateral trade flows, both in weight and free on-board values, for every traded commodity between 2016 and 2021. So we have, in the case of Malta, for example, all our imports by product and by origin country. This information is, however, also complemented by a disaggregation by mode of transport. So we know how much of these commodities, how much of these trade flows actually come by sea, which is what we focus on. And also we have information about the cost of transportation per trade flow. The only downside to the data is that the present version is limited to 2021 as the last data point. And of course, you know, we all know trading patterns change quite frequently, and we wanted to work as much as possible with most recent data and most recent patterns. So we combine this data with data from Eurostat about Malta's total imports of each commodity for 2023 by origin country. Now, the idea is to use these two data sources to eventually estimate commodity-specific increase in import prices of model first, and then to impose these commodity-specific increases in import prices into MACGMOD, which is a CGE model calibrated for Malta, which we developed last year. Now, as I told you, we assume that the additional transport costs are fully passed through to import prices. So given that assumption, we calculate the increase in commodity-specific import prices by the equation you see on this slide, which is basically the product of the expected increase in sea transport costs due to the ETS, the product of that, and the share of sea transport costs in the value of imports. Basically, what we're saying is that if there is going to be a shock to transport costs, that shock will only impact the portion of imports which actually constitutes sea transport costs. So off model, we'll calculate these two elements using the data. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into great detail about how we calculate these two elements. What I'll say is that for the first one, so when we calculate the share of sea transport costs in the value of Maltese imports, we work at a very granular level. So we work at the level of the trade flow. So you think of by product, by country. For every product, for every country, we work out the share of sea transport costs in that trade flow. And then we aggregate to a product level simply by summing across countries. The more difficult part was to estimate the second one, the expected increase in sea freight rates due to the ETS extension. I say it's more difficult because currently in the shipping industry there are a number of developments. You think about the Red Sea situation, which is also raising transport costs in its own right, but we had to focus only on the extra cost that is due to the ETS. And to do so, we followed a bit the literature. So we first link the extra ETS cost to the fuel costs of ships, and then, because fuel costs are a part of the overall costs of shipping, then we indirectly link it to the increase in freight rates to the overall cost of the ship. The last unknown that we had is the carbon price. So basically the cost at which these shipping companies have to compensate for their emissions. This is subject to quite a bit of uncertainty at the moment. So in this respect, we undertake a scenario analysis. So in the first scenario, we work with a price of 90 euro per ton of CO2. At the moment, it hovers around 70, but it's anticipated to rise. So as a first scenario, we consider 90 euro. As a second scenario, we consider a price of 150 euro, which is a consensus of the projections for the price in 2030. And in a third scenario, we consider a price of 200 euro, which there seems to be consensus in the projections that it will be the price reached in 2035. So under each of these scenarios, now we estimate the expected increase in import prices by product. And these are the results. So first thing to note is that there are a lot of commodities which will be impacted. This is a result of of the fact that we import most of our commodities, and we import most of our commodities by sea. So a lot of commodities that we import will be impacted. However, the expected impact is not expected to be large. The reason is that from our estimates, became clear that sea transport costs constitute a relatively small share of the value of our imports. So for most commodities, the share of sea transport costs in the value of imports hovers around 4 to 8%, depending on the commodity. For very few commodities, it goes up to a maximum of 12%, but it's not a large share of imports value. So essentially what we're saying is that this is going to be a shock which impacts a relatively small share of the value of our imports. So up to now we've worked off model. Now we impose these commodity-specific import price shocks into our model. To, of course, see the macro and sectoral effects of this shock. So in terms of macro effects, we see that this increase in import prices will raise overall prices, which of course drives down our export competitiveness, so our exports go down and also dampens domestic demand. This domestic demand is reflected in lower investment, imports, and labor demand. Because of lower labor demand, household disposable income declines, which is followed by a fall in consumption. The net effect on Malta's real GDP is expected to be between minus 0.12 and minus 0.26%, depending on the evolution of the carbon price. This is driven largely by the fall in consumption and investment, to a certain extent also exports, given the large size of exports in Malta's economic activity, but it is somewhat cushioned by the fall in imports due to the weaker economic activity. In terms of fiscal developments, we expect the government receipts in absolute terms to decline because government will receive lower tax revenues, but the fall in GDP will be greater. So the share, expressed as a ratio, government receipts to GDP ratio actually goes up. In terms of expenditures, there will be no absolute change in government expenditures, but because of the fall in GDP, again, the ratio also goes up. The net effect on the balance is negative, so deficit increases. But here, note that we do not consider the ETS's revenues that the Maltese government may get from the auctioning of the allowances, which could be recycled, and that will also have an effect on the government balance. At a more granular level, we show and we estimate also the expected increase in commodity prices, overall prices now. Apologies if the chart is a bit too small, but basically the story is that those commodities which we import by sea, they will be the most impacted by the shock. So these are actual products, actual goods. However, price increases are expected to be rather contained. So even if the ETS price goes up to €200 per ton of CO2, we don't envisage any price increases exceeding 2.5%. We have compared these numbers to estimates by the Commission, the European Commission. In its impact assessment report, it had stated, assuming an ETS price of €55, it had found that for most commodities, price increases would be limited to 0.5%. If you compare that to our assumption of a €90 ETS price, which is slightly less than double the €55 they assume, the blue dots, for most commodities, the increase in price won't exceed 1%. So essentially, once we, let's say, double the assumption on the ETS price, the expected price increases relative to what the Commission found actually doubles. So essentially, we are pretty much in line with what the Commission had found in terms of price increases. The exports of commodities which will be directly impacted by the higher import prices goes down by 0.5% to 1.2%, again, depending on the carbon price. But services, they typically become cheaper because of the lower economic activity. So as services become cheaper, it improves their export competitiveness, so we export more services. And when you think of services, you have gaming, you have financial services. If those exports go up, the overall effect on aggregate exports is actually dampened. So from the previous chart, you may have thought that the overall effect on exports is a bit small, but essentially that masks a lot of heterogeneity across the goods and services. Finally, the last result we'll show is the impact on real GVA by industry, and here essentially the product-specific results that I've shown you, they are closely reflected here. So here the sectors which will be mostly impacted are those that are closely linked to the commodities subject to the highest price increases. So you see a lot of manufacturing there. The reason is, of course, they make quite intense intermediate use of the commodities which will be impacted. So essentially, they will be subject to higher input costs. So to summarize the main findings, we find that the increase in Malta's commodity import prices should on average be quite limited, less than 2%. This is largely due to the fact that shipping costs typically constitute a rather minor share of the value of our imports. However, a lot will depend on different factors, for example, the evolution of the carbon price and also any changes in companies' port schedules, which may affect also the cost which the shipping companies will be subject to. Secondly, the increase in import prices we expect will raise overall prices. It will lead to a fall in consumption, investment, exports, and imports. The net effect on GDP is expected to be negative, but not large. And thirdly, this is probably what we expect as well, is that commodities and industries which will be directly exposed to the higher import prices, they are the ones which will be suffering the most. A word about the caveats. Keep in mind, our analysis considers the effects as from 2026. So in the short term, it is not inconceivable that the effects will be even a bit smaller, given that shipping companies, they have to compensate a smaller share of the emissions, not the 100%. Keep in mind as well that we assumed a full pass-through of the extra ETS costs, so we assume no changes to profit margins. And also we don't consider the ongoing situation in the Red Sea, which is causing diversions. So that means longer routes, higher fuel consumption, higher emissions, and the direct effect as well on the ETS cost. And also there may be some spillovers in the form of resulting from the import price shocks of other countries which we might experience, which also are not considered in this work. Really the final remarks. Of course, this is a reform that has come into place as from the start of this year. So there's a lot more information which has to come to light to better understand its full implications. A lot will depend on what the carbon price does in terms of the evolution, because of course that is the direct measure of the ETS cost, so how expensive it is for companies to pollute. We also have to consider the possibility of changes in shipping company strategies. So there's already some evidence that in European waters there is a greater presence of more efficient vessels as shipping companies try to avoid the ETS cost, or rather try to minimize their emissions in such a way that they minimize their cost. One other important implication which we don't consider in any way in this work is the effects on Malta's role as a transshipment hub. So there's a need to do more work in that sense. And also the final point I'll make is that this reform is just one piece of the puzzle. So there are a number of other reforms that are either already in place or will come into place over the next few years, which also deserve a study in the sense of their implications for Malta. I'm speaking about, for example, the applicability of this reform also to passenger cruise ships, potentially the extension of the Energy Tax Directive, which the proposal is to remove some of the subsidies, some of the current subsidies on the fuels used by shipping companies and in maritime transport in general, and also the phasing out of free allowances for the aviation sector, which is expected to come into play as from 2026. These are all issues that one can study in the near future. That is all from my end. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Are there any questions from the room? Maybe I can ask you something? Regarding like one of the caveats that you mentioned, like the indirect effects that come through imports from other countries. Like the modeling that you're using is capable to take into account that, or we will need to explore a different modeling approach?
For that, we would need to at least amalgamate our model with other tools, because we use SCGE, which basically is, at its heart, it's based on what's called social accounting matrix, which is basically input-output related. So we don't explicitly have a foreign block kind of thing. So to study that kind of thing, we would need to borrow from other tools within our modeling toolkit here at the department.
Okay, thank you. Are there? Yes, there is another question. Wait.
Oh God. Hi, Vanessa from the Monetary Policy Department. So just, I think it's related to that question what Massimo just asked. So the effect of on the GDP is basically just the consequence of the increase in the prices, or is it also taking into consideration the substitution to maybe a different shipment hub, or no?
No, we assume that the same patterns that worked up to now in 2023, they will carry forward in 2026, because that's what we assume. And there are no substitutions to different transport modes kind of thing. So it's purely the effect of, so we calculate of model the increase in import prices, then we say if we assume that the patterns that were there in 2023, they persist in 2026 in terms of what we import from where and by what mode of transport, what happens if we are subject to those import prices.
So overall the effects would probably be even more or greater than what you showed when we take into consideration.
Indirect effects, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask one question. If I understood correctly, Nathaniel, you mentioned that the price of services becomes relatively cheaper to goods. But are you assuming some substitution between demand for goods and services then? Because I'm not too sure, for example, you mentioned gaming, whether this is sort of a substitute to other goods.
No, we don't. So the elasticity of substitution among the goods and services is zero. So we don't assume any substitutability. That applies to all goods, actually.
Okay, Robert Suban, University of Malta. I have a few questions. The first one is, the numbers that you showed, these are on a per annum basis, or is it a one-off effect?
No, it's the overall effect. So once the shock is kind of fully propagates throughout the economy, so it's the final effect. It's not on a per annum, it's the total effect.
Okay. When it comes to the price of fuel that the shipping companies use, was it based on a set price, and you didn't take into account potential fluctuations in the oil price, and to what extent that would also have an impact on the prices?
No, so we assumed the price. So we assumed as a fuel, we assumed the very low sulfur fuel oil, which is the kind of fuel that is used very recently because it's cleaner by ships, and we assume that it's fixed at the recent average. So we took the average of this year. We assumed it's fixed at $700 per metric ton, and we assume that will remain fixed.
Okay, so you didn't try to do some sensitivity analysis should that price change?
No, technically it would be very easy to do that, but for this, the results you've seen are based on a fixed price of 700.
But do you think that if you that exercise would have been computed, the effects would have been bigger in terms of percentages compared to...
It would depend on what the fuel price would do. If we assume that the fuel price is higher, so instead of 700 it goes up to 800, then the ETS cost relative to the percentage increase then would be lower, so the effects would be lower. But if the price of fuel actually goes down below 700, then the extra ETS cost charge as a share of that fuel would be greater than what we show here, so the effects would eventually be higher.
And last question, I presume that you didn't take into account efforts by shipping companies to try to green their fleet?
No.
Okay.
No. But that is a good point, and that's why we mention it also in the conclusions. And there is already evidence of that, so of more efficient vessels in and around Europe.
Other questions? Okay, so an applause for Nathaniel's presentation.
Thank you.
And now, Warren De Guara is going to present mitigating climate change and its impact on local firms, evidence from a recent CBM survey.
So, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for this year's annual research workshop. As Massimo just said, in this presentation I'll be providing some results from a survey we conducted amongst local firms, which focuses on climate change and how mitigating climate change will or is expected to impact firm operations and their plans for the near future. As always, the usual disclaimer applies. The views expressed in this presentation should not be interpreted as reflecting the views of the Central Bank. So, to start off, a brief outline of what we'll be discussing over the next few minutes. First of all, the motivation behind the study. And then, given that, as I've already said, this is based on survey data, I'll be giving a short description of the sampling methodology employed, and as well of the characteristics of the firms surveyed. Following that, I'll move on to speak about the main topics covered in this survey, starting with awareness, that is environmental awareness, followed by transition and physical risks, and lastly, investment and its financing. I will then close this presentation with some concluding remarks and offer some policy recommendations. As I'm sure most of you know, climate change is one of the most pervasive global challenges. Extreme weather events have been increasing, and therefore this requires immediate action. Action not just by us as consumers, as households, but more importantly by government entities and by firms. This is because failure to act would potentially cause competitiveness losses for many firms and also increased regulatory costs. Moreover, the physical risks associated with climate change can have considerable repercussions on the effectiveness of monetary policy, particularly in controlling inflation. This is because any action in mitigating climate change is at least a priori often associated with a heightened risk of upward inflationary pressures. Moreover, actions towards a greener environment undoubtedly requires significant scaling up of investments. So this is why we felt it was the right time to conduct this survey, to obtain insights from companies directly, and see how their mitigation efforts will impact their operations, and perhaps more what we're interested in, how does it impact their investment outlook. So the survey adopts a controlled quota sampling framework, which basically is a non-probabilistic sampling method whereby individuals are chosen according to specific traits or qualities. And in this case, the survey considers firms that are likely to have the most emission-intensive activities. So basically this is determined by scaling the firm's respective sectors' greenhouse gas emissions to the sector's own gross value added. So basically after we identify the emission intensity for each sector, we map our list of firms to these sectors, and we sample from those we classify as high GHG greenhouse gas intensive emitting sectors and mid GHG intensive emitting sectors. And we try to have a sample which is roughly equally split between these two categories. Over and above that, the selection of firms tries to closely mirror the population's sectoral structure as much as possible, when this is sorted by GHG intensity. And as such, the most represented sector is the wholesale and retail sector, followed closely by the services sector, and then by the manufacturing sector. Now, due to the way we formulated this sample, it turned out that most of the surveyed firms are well established, or they have been in operation for over 30 years, and more than half of these surveyed companies generate over 10 million euros in revenue, in annual revenue, right? Given also that we excluded micro firms, the firms surveyed employ quite a decent number of workers, with the largest share employing between 50 to 249 employees. So in this survey, the first topic we wanted to focus on was awareness, general environmental awareness. Now, research out there focuses on the awareness of physical and transition risks, but we first wanted to shed light on the awareness of general environmental awareness and, moreover, firms' awareness of several EU directives or initiatives. And you find that around 47% of respondents claim that general environmental awareness in Malta is low. And this is also corroborated by the second point that we present on this slide. When we asked companies whether they are aware of EU-wide climate initiatives, the majority of firms responded negatively, with a surprising 70% of firms claiming that they are not aware of the EU's Fit for 55, which is the European Union's main climate-related objective. Although awareness of other initiatives is a bit higher, it is still well below what we have expected. We notice as well that overall awareness among firms which operate in high GHG intensive emitting sectors is higher than those in mid-GHG intensive emitting sectors. And perhaps this is because these companies are larger in size and maybe they are more aware of the repercussions of their activities. Consequently, the awareness of how such EU initiatives will impact firm operations is found to be very mixed, as slightly more than half these surveyed firms, precisely 51%, responded that they do not know how these regulations or initiatives or directives will impact their business. So this leads our discussion to transition risks and to the awareness of physical and transition risks. As you may be aware, the impact of climate change emanates from both these types of risks. Physical risks are direct impacts from climate change on production processes, the population and the infrastructure, while transition risks are those associated with the extent firms manage and adapt in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adopt renewable energies. Now, when we ask firms about the expected impact of transitioning to a low-carbon economy, overall firms seem more aware of the repercussions of the transition, as around a third of companies interviewed reported that they expect to be impacted negatively, while around 28% expect a positive impact. So this means that although the gap between the negatives and the positives is small, the proportion of firms that see this transition to be a risk is still slightly higher than those that see it as an opportunity. And this mirrors findings in other surveys, such as the 2023 European Investment Bank surveys. When it comes to physical risks, awareness is also very high, with almost 50% of firms projecting high to moderate physical impacts over the next 10 years, and this share of firms increases to 60% over the next 20 years. Despite these anticipated risks from both transition and physical risks, results show that firms still see some positive opportunities. And indeed, the chart on the right shows us that around 85% of surveyed firms see climate change accelerating the take-up of alternative sources of energy generation, and around 75% agree that it will increase the digitalization process. So this means, first of all, this is undoubtedly a key takeaway from the survey, because it means that climate change presents firms with an extra incentive to better their operations and become more efficient. Unfortunately, we also find that firms report increasing costs and supply chain disruptions, as reported by around 62% of firms. And when we try to dig deeper into the impact on costs and consequently prices, we find that the absolute majority of firms, so over 80%, believe that climate change mitigation will make raw materials and energy inputs more expensive, and it will make carbon prices a relevant cost component. And as such, consequently, 90% of firms expect climate change mitigation. It will force them to increase their selling prices. When it comes to investment, over 80% of firms agree that mitigating climate change will first of all require the development of new technologies. It will require investment in existing technologies, and obviously it will increase the overall level of investment. And in fact, we find that when asked how firms can contribute to a carbon neutral economy, the vast majority, again over 80%, responded that investing in energy efficient technologies is the main or the most important measure. We also find that water conservation and the implementation of more sustainable policies within the firm were also found to be important measures. We also asked firms what are the risks of not investing, so basically not taking any action. And the main reasons, the main risks cited by companies were increased regulatory costs, high energy prices, competitiveness losses, and an overall negative perception of their firm. A good chunk of these companies interviewed reported that they have already started to implement such changes. 67% have already started to implement these measures. And although this has a large share, it is still lower than the share of companies reporting that some action is required. Right? So there is this gap. And the reason for this gap could be issues in obtaining finance. Now, financing this investment is crucial. We know from various surveys, again, such as the European Investment Bank survey and our own internal business dialogue survey, that local firms rely significantly on internal funding for investments. Surveys also point at firms having issues with accessing finance for investment, again, as reported by the EIB 2023 investment survey. Now, when it comes to green investments, our survey finds that 72% of respondents do not have a recurring budget for green investments. And we also find that around 80% of respondents had less than 20% of their total investment in the last financial year dedicated either for environmental sustainable measures or for energy efficiency measures. And this can be seen on the chart on the left. With regards to the next financial year, the proportion of total investment dedicated to green initiatives is still expected to remain below the 20% mark. Moreover, results from this survey also show that the percentage of firms that make use of grants or schemes is still very low. Okay? And in fact, we find 64% of surveyed firms did not use any grant or scheme available to them. And again, these results are also corroborated by findings from other surveys. So while the use of grants is low, we know that Malta has a very high take-up of EU funding. So this might show that despite this high availability of grants, the dispersion or coverage of these funds across the whole spectrum of Maltese firms is very low. And obviously there is scope to facilitate financing, which is perhaps the most important policy recommendation from the study. This finding is also corroborated by an open-ended question we included in the survey, which asked companies what more can the government do to aid in the transition towards carbon neutrality, and most replies revolved around increasing grants and tax incentives, provide professional assistance, decrease bureaucracy and make access to funding or grants easier, promote which funding streams, advisory services and government schemes are available, and offer incentives to large corporations and not just small and medium enterprises. So to conclude, the findings from this survey point to several key policy recommendations to support Maltese firms in their transition to an environmentally sustainable economy. First of all, enhancing awareness is critical. A concerted effort is needed to educate firms about climate change initiatives and their implications. This would ensure that they are well informed and prepared to act. Secondly, facilitating financing for green investments is essential. This could include improving access to grants or financing schemes, reducing bureaucratic hurdles, and providing professional assistance to help firms navigate the funding landscape. Incentivizing investments through tax breaks, subsidies, or other financial incentives can further encourage firms to adopt sustainable practices. Lastly, fostering innovation by supporting the development and adoption of new technologies that reduce emissions and enhance efficiency is vital for long-term sustainability. By addressing these three key areas, local firms can thrive in a carbon-neutral future. This approach would not only benefit the environment, but also strengthen the resilience and longer-term competitiveness of the Maltese economy in the face of global challenges. And that's all from my end. Thank you for your time and attention, and if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thanks. No, thanks. It was an interesting presentation. I was thinking whether, so first you can, because this type of initiatives, of course, helps a lot understanding the picture we have in front of us, in terms of how to split firms into green and brown. And from your presentation was not clear whether you have only a backward-looking measures of whether firms is brown or green, because intensity normally is not the right measures you want to use. You want to use something more forward-looking, like plans, or whether these firms disclose plans for transition. And by the way, if you have a second wave of this survey, then it's even more important that you monitor the disclosure of plans, whether they are doing just greenwashing or whether they are able to stick to their plan. So that's the first question. The second question is whether they was a bit missed in your presentation, whether the financial part of all that is also included in the survey. So basically, do they see banks, for example, reacting to their potential plans to transition? So we know, for example, that there is a lot of supervisory activity in pricing their climate exposure or penalizing brown exposure in the banks. So you might expect that this is passed through the firms, and then firms that are becoming greener might get better lending conditions. I don't know if you have all that in the picture. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. So basically, unfortunately, yes, it is a sort of a backward-looking approach. This is based on actual available data on GVA and GHG emissions. As you said, it would be very interesting to carry out a second wave of the survey and to see how results develop and how companies approach develop. With regards to financing banks, unfortunately, we did not have any question which asks basically what is the relationship with banks, whether they find difficulties in obtaining finance. Basically, we tied the findings from these surveys with other internal surveys we have amongst local firms. Basically, from what we can take out from this survey is that take-up of these funds or grants is low, probably also because they are unaware of what is available out there, not just, for example, applying for these funds and not being eligible. But yes, unfortunately, we do not have information on their relationship with banks, whether they would be available to grant these loans. But it's an interesting thing to include for future research.
Warren, you made the observation from the survey that the use of grants or EU funds is relatively low. My question is whether from the survey you were able to detect whether this is a question of demand or whether it's a question of supply of EU funds. Because I'm asking this question because from some comments I heard from industry, their arguments were that it seems that most of these funds are being utilized by the public sector itself, and they had not sort of the availability of funds was not there. But I'm not sure whether it's a question of demand or supply, at least from the results of the survey.
Thank you for the question. From what we can deduce, it seems like it seems to be an issue from both ends. What we can say for sure is that they found it very challenging and bureaucratic to apply for certain funds, so it may have made them lose their hope or not try in the first place. We should also keep in mind that given that awareness is still very low, companies might not even know that there are available grants, and they won't even try to do something like that. So demand, from what I expect, demand is a bit more of an influential factor in this case.
I was wondering whether you have enough responses to say something about heterogeneities across sectors.
So, first of all, we do appreciate that this is an internal survey, so resources were a bit limited. We have responses from 100 companies. We do try to make some distinction between sectors. We try to stay away from giving figures for the sake that the sample is not as large as one would hope it to be.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Warren. On the issue of the demand and supply of such funding, could you maybe consider comparing your results with other data sources or other surveys? I am thinking especially of the SAFE survey, which probably would include some questions regarding the availability of finance for green issues, and also the availability of EU funds. There is data available on the granting of EU funds for some beneficiaries, individual beneficiaries. You would be able to find that information.
Okay.
So you could then be able to compare it with your own internal sources, so as to have a better idea in terms of concentration in which industries they are being.
We'll do that. Thank you, John. Thank you.
A few questions once again, so I'll do them one after the other, so you don't have to remember. The sample, so this was on a voluntary basis?
Yes.
Okay.
There was no financial incentive for companies to take place.
Did you try to map out the respondents in terms of how much of the total emissions they represent?
It's very difficult to, you would need data, by firm level data. So it's very difficult to calculate how much emissions each and every company.
Or maybe take a proxy, the industry from which they come from, and look a bit at the...
We can try that. To be honest, we haven't.
Okay, because it would be interesting to see a bit...
we do it by sector, at the most granular level.
And then I noticed that in the respondents there were no firms in the energy production sector.
Probably they would be part of the four main sectors. This is the way we do it. When we distinguish by sector, we use the four main sectors: manufacturing, processing, retail, services, and construction. And it would be in one of those.
Okay. On one slide, you also mentioned whether the companies see this climate change as an opportunity or having negative impact. And I noticed that there were around fairly close percentage of companies who see it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Again, did you try to make a distinction from which sectors these respondents were coming from? Are these, for example, companies working in the energy renewable sector?
By that granular level, no, we haven't. From what I remember, this survey was done in 2023, so my memory wouldn't be. From what I remember, the response rate from the energy sector wasn't very high. So again, making this distinction would be a bit more challenging. So again, we try to stick to distinguishing between the four main sectors. So to answer your question would be a bit challenging, but it would be an interesting thing to look at. And hopefully, when we look at the companies, each and every company separately, we'll try to make some conclusions on this as well.
And the last question, a lot of the concerns were related to the energy prices. So do you think that the fact that the energy prices are still being heavily subsidized is a lack of incentive to try to transition?
Obviously, that would be making personal opinions, but it could probably very well be the case, yes. Obviously, companies, their mind is at rest that current energy costs are subsidized. When this would end, no one would know, but my expectation would be that yes, this is probably pushing their investment decisions to a later date. Hopefully, this would not hold them back from actually carrying out investments and investing in renewable energies.
Thank you, Warren, for that presentation. My question is also regarding the sample of the firms that you used, because it doesn't say on the paper that you used 100, that was the return of 100 firms that were from what number? Because you obviously didn't interview the micro, if I understood from the presentation. So what percentage is it representing?
So basically, if I remember correctly, the final list of companies that we could actually target was around 2,000, if I remember correctly. As we said, due to limitations, basically manpower and financial limitations, we try to strive for a sample of around 100 companies. It's a sample that we would comfortably say that it somewhat represents the population, although it is not a probabilistic sample, so it's not a simple random, for example, type of sample. We cannot comfortably say it reflects the population. However, we do make efforts to try to have a sample which is roughly close to what the population out there is. But yes, unfortunately, the number of observations is a limitation from the study. Hopefully, in the future, we would try to carry out a survey which is larger in size. But obviously, this obviously depends on a lot of other factors.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Now I invite on the floor Lynn Kumbo, who will present the estimation of STREAM, the macroeconometric model of the Maltese economy, which is joint work with Jan Borg and Noel Rappa.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I will be delivering the presentation on the re-estimation of STREAM. This is joint work conducted with Ian Borg, Noel Rappa, and myself. So the views expressed throughout this presentation are our own and not reflecting those of the Central Bank. So STREAM is the semi-structural model of the Maltese economy used within the bank. And in this article, we document its update to version 3.2 from the previous version that was re-estimated in 2019. Overall, STREAM remains faithful to its original three key objectives, which are to allow for the assessment of the impact of shocks by conducting simulations on the model, to act as the main model for the bank's forecast, and to provide insight on how the Maltese economy functions. The macroeconomic principles that underlie this model are neoclassical, which means that supply drives output in the long run and demand drives output in the short run. So a brief history of the model. STREAM was first developed in 2013 by the Modeling and Research Office at the bank. Version 2 of STREAM was developed in 2014 with a more refined fiscal and financial blocks. enhanced macro-financial linkages, and a price block that was made more responsive to the domestic activity. Version 3 of Stream was developed in 2016 with an even richer financial block, and it was re-estimated using training data for the first time. Version 3.1 was re-estimated up to data on 2016 Q4, and this version is our starting point, so we re-estimate based on this version and we compare our results compared to version 3.1. Stream version 3.1 was also extended with a housing block and a sectoral extension in 2020. However, we do not consider these extensions in our re-estimation. So now we are at Stream version 3.2 with its database updated until 2022 Q4 using the 2022 Q4 vintage of national accounts. So we do not consider the recent benchmark revision in national accounts. Its behavioral equations have been re-estimated until 2019 Q4 as a quarterly frequency. So we exclude the pandemic period from our re-estimation. The model now includes 213 equations, of which 21 of these are estimated behavioral equations in error correction form. We have 213 endogenous variables and 57 exogenous variables. And the model consists of 5 blocks: the supply and demand block, the fiscal block, the price wage block, and the financial block. With this extended sample, Stream is now more reflective of the more recent economic regime, which was characterized by strong economic growth, a resilient labor market, and stable prices. So as I said, the equations in Stream are estimated in error correction form, so we have both short-run elasticities and long-run elasticities. And in these next few slides, I will go through the re-estimated elasticities and compare them to those from the previous version. So starting with the short-run elasticities, overall we have a smaller magnitude of the value of these elasticities, as you can see in the table when compared to the previous version. So for example, we have the short-run elasticity of consumption with respect to disposable income. It is now at 0.13 from 0.3, and it reflects a lower marginal propensity to consume and therefore the higher savings in disposable income. We also have a weaker response of exports to foreign demand, and this reflects the resilience of Maltese services exports. We also have a more practical response of imports, so the short-run elasticity of imports with respect to the model consistent import demand indicator is at 0.96. And this is because this import demand indicator is based on import intensities of demand components. So what we did is we further disaggregated these demand components and revised their import intensities based on 2015 input and output tables. Next are the long-run elasticities, and these are the error correction terms within the model. So overall, we observe a smaller error correction terms, and this is partly due to the longer time series that we have in this version. And this reflects a slower adjustment of the economy from long-run equilibrium, of imbalances from long-run equilibrium. So here I am showing the error correction terms of the main equations and comparing them to the previous version. So we have the private consumption equation, the private investment, exports, the GDP deflator equation, and in the case of the import deflator, the long-run elasticity remained the same because it was already quite small. We have the employment equation and private wages. So as I said in the beginning, one of the main objectives of Stream is to assess the impact of shocks by conducting simulations on the model. And I will be showing the impact from 4 simulations that we conduct, and these simulations are in line with an ECB request for a Euro area-wide exercise, which is called the Basic Model Elasticities. So these simulations are standard across all Euro area and CBs, So we do not construct these simulations ourselves. And I will be showing the impact from a foreign demand shock, an interest rate shock, an energy price shock, and an exchange rate shock. I will show the IRFs for 4 key macroeconomic variables to show the impact of these shocks. These simulations are conducted under an orthogonality principle, so we shock one exogenous variable while keeping the other exogenous variables constant. As you will see in the next few slides, the impacts are overall more muted and more prolonged when compared to the impacts from the previous version. So these are the IRFs that I will show, and these show the percentage change from the baseline level. So starting with the foreign demand shock, it is defined as a permanent 1% increase in foreign demand. So when foreign demand increases, we export more, and therefore GDP increases, as you can see from the first chart. With this increase in economic activity, we have higher pressure on prices, so the impact on HICP is positive. The situation in the labor market improves because we have higher employment, and with regards to the fiscal sector, the government balance also improves. And as you can see, the blue line, which is the impact from this more recent version of STREAM, is lower than the impact from the red line, which is the impact from the previous version, and this shows the more muted and prolonged effect from the shocks. Next is the interest rate shock, and this is defined as a permanent increase in the policy interest rate by 100 basis points. So when the policy interest rate increases, it is transmitted through lending rates, which negatively affects consumption and investment. Therefore, we have a negative effect on economic activity. This puts downward pressure on prices, so they decline. The situation in the labor market also deteriorates because we have lower compensation per employee, and so does the government balance, because government incurs higher interest payments and also higher expenditure on automatic stabilizers. And as you can see here, the impact is also more muted because it is less negative when compared to the previous version. And in this case, the impact is also more muted because we have a lower implied intertemporal elasticity of intertemporal substitution. Next is the energy price shock. So essentially, we have two types of energy price shocks. We have a gas price shock and an oil price shock, but in the interest of time here, I will be only showing the impact from an oil price shock. However, in the article, we go into further detail on both. So in this case, the energy price shock is defined as a permanent 10% increase in the price of oil at the 85 euro per barrel level. So this energy price shock acts as a supply side shock, which increases prices and therefore has a negative impact on economic activity. In the labor market, compensation per employee increases. However, this does not mean that we have higher disposable income, because part of this increase in compensation per employee is eroded by inflation. With regards to the fiscal sector, the government balance improves in this case because revenues are higher than expenditure. And finally, we have the exchange rate shock, and this is defined as a permanent 10% appreciation of the euro against the US dollar. So as the euro appreciates, we have some loss in competitiveness, we export less, and therefore the impact on economic activity is negative. And as you can see, the negative impact is more prolonged, which puts further downward pressure on prices, and therefore the impact is more negative when compared to the previous version. The situation in the labor market deteriorates because we have lower compensation per employee, and on the government side, the fiscal balance deteriorates, but to a lesser extent, because although expenditure offsets revenue, this happens to a lesser extent than before. Finally, to conclude, STREAM version 3.2 is now more reflective of the recent economic environment. it continues to be a central model in the bank's research and modeling toolkit. So we expect further work to be conducted to further develop this model. So currently work is being done on the supply side of the model. The bank's modeling office is trying to account for population channels and ensuring long-run convergence to long-run growth rates. And in the next versions, we will be expected to be dealing with the volatile data during the pandemic years, which we omitted in this version, and of course, be dealing with the more recent benchmark revision in national accounts. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions.
Good morning, Glenn, everyone. Thank you. My name is John Caruana. I have three points about your presentation. First of all, thanks to you and to your colleagues for this work on Stream. I have two questions related to public finance and one related to monetary policy. So, on the public finance, given that you've re-estimated the model, is it possible to generate a new estimate of the fiscal multiplier? So if you have a balanced fiscal shock, no? In the BMEs, you can do these fiscal shocks, say, to government consumption or government investment or tax, and then you see the effects on GDP. Maybe even bilaterally, it would be nice for me to see what's changing on the fiscal side. Also related to the fiscal side, but to the shock prior to the one that you're showing now, so the energy price shock, you'll see the effects on the fiscal balance have changed sign between the two versions, and I was wondering why it should change sign. So in the earlier version, there's a negative impact on the, if I'm right, no, on the balance, and now there is a positive impact on the balance. I was wondering why this is the case. Also because we know that during the extended estimation period, basically, energy prices were left unchanged. They've been left unchanged for a long time. And the third question I have is on the interest rate shock. You have some results. The numbers I've been seeing from bank lending rates and mortgage rates and so on indicate that the pass-through is very, very low. I don't know what Massimo will be saying in the afternoon about monetary transmission, but what are you assuming on the pass-through from the policy rate shocks, say, to the bank lending rates or the bank deposit rates? How does that, how is the transmission flowing through this re-estimated version of your model? So thanks again. Thank you for all the work, and keep it up. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I'll start with replying to your question on the fiscal balance. So first of all, the change is very small. So previously it was minus 0.02, and now it is 0.02. So it's very, very few percentage points. And this happens because of the transmission of the shock on the nominal side of the economy. So as you can see, we have on the real side, on GDP, we have a lower impact than before, while on the nominal side, with regards to prices, we have a higher impact. So the effect on it's basically a denominator effect. Yes, exactly. Yes, with regards to the interest rate shock, so as you know, so this does not reflect the recent monetary policy tightening. It was re-estimated until 2019, so there was no tightening going on. As you know, the transmission of rates is imperfect in Malta, so this is why we have this kind of results. And I hope that answers your question, John. And with regards to the fiscal multiplier, Noel, if you can elaborate on that.
Yes, sure. Yes, John, we can do around for fiscal multipliers. Some of them are already part of the BMEs. So obviously we have already done those in order to answer for those requests. But if you have any specific multiplier in mind, we can always do that with this model. Just remember that this is a semi-structured model. It's a reduced form model. It's subject to the usual critique that these models are subject to, and that's why when we do publish fiscal multiplier results, we usually tend to augment these results with other models which are more structural in nature, so as to give a more complete and holistic picture to the fiscal multiplier question. But yes, we can if you require.
So first of all, thanks for the presentation. It's Malcolm Bray from BOV. Basically, I'm trying to understand the narrative of the change. So basically, you said that the short-term elasticities have generally gone down, and the ECM has generally gone down. So basically, we're reacting less to in the short run, and we're taking longer to reach the long run, which to me, that makes the model much less sensitive to developments, which means that it gives you a sense of stability. It's like things moving on an autopilot, you know, because the shocks that are happening, in fact, you show, you know, with the various shocks, in general, roughly speaking, the impact on GDP has been more muted, which basically also explains why if you look, for example, at the CBM latest forecast vintages, you'll see in the outer years always, you know, rather stable growth, 3.54, which now has become a mantra. You know, the economy is moving, that's the long-term average, and we're going there. But then I try to see, you know, in 2020 we had a large shock, and we realized that the economy was much more resilient than we thought with the benchmark revision. And even in the post-pandemic growth, the economy has been much stronger. So if I put everything together, to me it's like we're getting more confused about the economy. We don't know why the economy is performing so well, because we're doing exceptionally well, and what our models are telling us is that our economy is reacting much less to whatever is happening, which goes against, you know, the idea that Malta is a small economy, so it's more vulnerable, blah, blah, blah. And the final point is the major revision in the import with respect to import demand, which you have there. That, I think, is a major change, which I'd like to appreciate the implications of that. So, thank you.
Yes, so indeed you are right. We are reacting less to external shocks, and remember this version of the model was re-estimated on 2019. So as I said, it was an economic environment of strong growth that was not, prices were not reacting to the strong growth, so the model captures these relations in the economy. So yes, of course, the impacts are much less than before, because we are in fact have a more resilient economy. And with regards to imports reacting to import demand, so previously we had, since the short-run elasticity was greater than 1 here, imports were overshooting. Imports were reacting more to the import demand. So that was kind of cushioning some of the effects of the shocks. So now we have a more reasonable reaction that does not capture all the shock into imports, and it is spread out on other components of GDP and economic activity. Yes, Ian will elaborate on it.
Yes, so just to also answer or to also continue on what Lynn has said, also with regards to the outlook, it is so, as you said, Malcolm, we go probably towards more to 3.5% in the outer years, which is less to do probably with this model as such, but more with our assessment of the long-run potential output growth. So I think one thing you'll see between us and others is that we have probably a lower estimate of long-run potential output growth. 3.5% is still, I think, a very good long run. So I think that is less to do with this model. But on the other hand, as we've seen in the last 10 years probably, we have consistently been surprise to the upside. So the economy has done much better than what we thought it will do. And I think in some sense, this model, as Lynn said, captures that effect in terms of, for example, exports, services exports, for example, gaining a lot of market share over time due to new industries coming in, and it has less to do with the dynamics of foreign demand, and it has more to do with the economy growing because of growing industries. Thank you.
I just have one question about the difference between version 3.1 and 3.2, just to make sure I'm understanding. This is just the change. These changes are coming from the re-estimation, so there were no changes in the modeling structure, right? So, for example, in the GDP deflator, there's one of the biggest changes, and even the ECM correction. It is coming from the re-estimation of data.
Yes.
Right?
So yes, basically the article documents this re-estimation. So we have effects from revised data as well. So previously was re-estimated up to 2016, so that data was revised as well. We extended the sample up to 2019, which included a period of, again, strong growth and a resilient economy. And the relationships remain broadly unchanged within the economy, so we don't have no major differences, like surprising differences. And with regards to, yes, the GDP deflator and the output gap, that has to do with the reaction of prices with regards to the strong growth. So, as I said, there was strong growth with prices not reacting to this growth, so therefore the relationship of the output gap with relation to economy-wide prices has weakened slightly because it was not being captured in the data used in this re-estimation.
And also another question relates to the interest rate shock.
Yes.
If you could elaborate a bit more how it is modeled in the model, because there is a more attenuated shock, but it's still the direction is still significant when you sort of look at how banks price interest rates in the Maltese market. So I was wondering sort of what the financial block in the model, how it is, how the transmission mechanism is modeled.
So this shock, we increased the ECB policy rate by 100 basis points, and then it transmits to the different lending rates. So we have mortgage rates, consumer credit, and basically it reacts through the equations of the credit in the financial block. Don't know if you...
I mean, there are sort of certain adjustments, like, for example, liquidity levels of the banks.
No.
How they price NFCs versus...
No, we do not consider the bank channels.
Okay.
Hi, good morning. Jonathan Falzon from Rizza Farrugia Stockbrokers. My comment relates also to this interest rate shock assessment, because based on what we went through over the past 2-3 years, I think we have a very sort of clear experience of the results of the movement of the interest rates by the ECB. And to me, it's quite a surprise that it seems to have a negative implication on economic activity and GDP, even relating to the comments that were shared here previously. Because obviously, when considering the various aspects of the local economy, there are quite a number of sectors that are actually benefiting from an increase in rates. And even if if we were to assume a pass-through, so we would assume that the loans would increase, which actually didn't. But even if you assume that, I think we should also assume that the interest rates on deposits will also increase, and considering that the amount of deposits in the local economy is much higher than the amount of loans, this could also buffer or even have a positive effect on the local economy in general. Furthermore, given the extent of liquidity among the local community, one I think has also to factor the opportunities that were created in a higher interest rate environment for even the retail investors to invest locally or foreign, and therefore attract much more income than previously was available. Thank you.
Yes, keep in mind what happens in reality is different to the shock. So this is a simulation. So it's not a reflection of reality, just for assessing potential impacts. And we are also, as I said in the beginning, we shock one variable, and the other factors, like you mentioned, like for example, spillover effects, to positive spillover effects are kind of ignored because only one variable is changed in this model setup.
Yeah,
Yes, Ian.
If I may also, so I think as Lynn is saying, these are simulations, right? So and also based on data until 2019, so it does not take into account the recent tightening. As we know, and as probably will be shown later, the interest rate pass-through was even lower, no? But consider that that situation might have been, let's say temporary, but it doesn't mean that in general. So in terms of simulations, when you think about simulations, you need to take into, let's say, an average impact, say, right? So in fact, I think what we get as a criticism from the ECB is that these are too low. And not just us, right? So also other countries would get higher than this, but still they would be considered low, because other models that are not similar to this would probably give you even higher shocks. So I mean, so of course when we use these shocks and when we use them in our analysis, then we would have to take into account what is happening, right? So but still, I think if you consider these impacts compared to other countries, they're still extremely low, right? So, and this is just the bank interest rate channels. Of course, there are other channels of monetary policy. It would be hard to sell a story where an interest rate shock would give you a positive GDP, because that would lead to explosive behavior, which hopefully we don't get. Although, I mean, for a temporary part, it might happen, but not permanently, let's say. Yes.
I think Noel wishes to add something.
Yes, I agree with my colleagues. Apart from another point that I wish to make, though, is that you have said that when there is an increase in interest rate, there are investment opportunities going on, and you need to take those into consideration. In a sense, the model takes these in consideration, because you need to remember we're after economic activity and price behavior here. This is not about financial gains only. So basically what's happening here is, when you have an interest rate increase, you have an opportunity cost of what to do with your money. Basically, if I have more incentives to save or invest, which is the same thing, remember, and if you mop up this excess liquidity from the real economic system, from the real economic side, what's happening here is that people have less money to consume, people have less money to go around and consume, reducing price pressures and reducing economic activity. That is the way in which a bank lending channel works, and this is the way this model is capturing it. These particular simulations do not have a detailed banking system with financial block in them. However, if I were to do these same simulations with a detailed financial block, which we do have, it's just that we're not showing them here, we will not see very much a different behavior, very much a different behavior from what we're seeing here, because despite the fact that deposit rates are, that deposit volumes are very large, as you said, and they have a positive disposable income effect, which you alluded to, that would not be enough to counteract these effects that we're seeing here. So these results would hold even if we if we turn on the financial sector within this model. I think Sandro also wants to.
First of all, typically when you have a rise in interest rate, the channel of transmission is that basically, first of all, the purpose of raising interest rate is to slow down demand at the end of the day. So basically we want to have weaker growth. That's why we raise interest rate with the objective, of course, with weaker growth to lower inflation. So that is the alternative. So the channel of transmission is you raise the cost of borrowing, so that essentially that would mean less demand for investment by firms, and that would, of course, lower demand for activity. Now, it's true, if you raise interest rates, the return on deposits increase, but that is not enough to offset these effects. And if we look at our own situation here in Malta, over 80–90% of deposits are in demand deposits. They yield zero interest. So effectively, there is no impact on disposable income. We've seen some flight towards term deposits, yes, but it is very, very, very marginal. So the overall effect at the end of the day of an interest rate shock, this is basically in line with economic theory, that you have a decline in GDP, a decline in inflation, and of course the labor market also will have a negative impact from the increase in interest rates. And this is the whole purpose essentially of a tighter monetary policy at the end of the day.
Is it working? Yes. Thank you, Lynn. So now I invite my colleague Noel, that will talk about the economic effects of the fixed energy price policy in Malta.
So first of all, I would like to thank you again for attending to this event. It is very exciting for us to be able to share with you our research. As the name implies of this presentation, I will be talking about the macroeconomic effects of a very important government policy that has been enacted since 2021, basically the fixed energy price policy in Malta, which has fixed fuel and electricity prices since basically 2021. Again, the usual disclaimer applies. These are my views and my views only. As a motivation, I think it's quite easy to motivate this subject. As you all know, the energy market globally has undergone severe shocks. It has started really post-COVID with a recovery that has outstripped the demand. So basically, energy demand which outstripped supply, which has been made worse within the EU market by the Russia-Ukraine war. And this has to do, obviously, with the EU's dependency, at least up till 2021, on Russian energy commodities. I'm just quoting two figures to give you an idea of the magnitudes that we're talking about. Basically, 43% of refined fuel imported in the EU in 2021 was imported from Russia, mainly diesel, and 45% of LPG was imported from Russia. What this meant is that by 2022, mainly in September, so in the last quarter of this year, we have seen EU natural TTF gas prices, this is the benchmark price that is used in the European market, has shot up to 240 euro per megawatt hour. And just to give you again an idea, its long run average is 20 euro per megawatt hour, so this is a 24 times increase. The crude oil here has also increased, as you can see, but this chart masks an even more pronounced increase in refining margins, which have increased by around 80 euro per barrel at their peak. This has prompted EU governments to intervene massively, I might add. Between 2021 and 2023, the total EU27 government allocation was around 540 billion euro. That is equivalent to 3.2% of GDP, of Euro-wide GDP, just to give you an idea. This is allocation, not actually spent, just to clarify my argument. There are two types of interventions, broadly speaking, that governments have adopted. One of them are price caps, which are similar to what Malta had. So basically governments intervening in the wholesale or even in the retail energy sector to dampen or to completely fix energy prices. And the other side of the story rests on compensation and transfers, which governments have chosen to give to industry and consumers and households. There is quite a lot, so in the chart here, it's broken down by type and by country. You can see quite a lot of cross-country heterogeneity in the total amount and breakdown, so there is quite a lot of heterogeneity, for instance, in the total magnitude. So countries like Sweden, Finland have either opted or had the necessity to intervene less in the market, whereas countries such as Malta, Greece, have opted to intervene more. There is also heterogeneity in terms of the response, with, for instance, Germany focusing much of its aid in terms of compensation schemes and refunds, whereas countries such as Malta obviously focusing more on price fixing. Malta is an extreme example, obviously, because the Maltese government has chosen to fix all energy prices, fuel and electricity to 2021 levels. As you can see here in this chart, Malta also features as one of the highest, as one of the countries with the highest expenditure, also with most of it being price targeting measures. So we stand out with these two features, sort of. And the motivation behind this study is quite obvious, given the considerable expenditure that has been going on, what have been the macro implications, and obviously at what cost. The outline of the presentation is fairly standard. I will go a little bit into the model. I will not go into detail, but you need some background to understand what is going on. Then I will go into the estimation of the energy subsidy scheme using, I will explain a little bit simulation design and go into the results before concluding. So what I am using here, basically I start off with a fairly standard small open economy DSG model for Malta with a detailed fiscal block. When I say detailed fiscal block, it basically has a number of fiscal instruments, taxes, expenditure items, all the bells and whistles that you come to expect out of these medium-scale DSG models. This is a model that has been developed here at the bank in 2016, and what I do is I further extend it using borrowing from recent literature, from the ECB and the Commission, amongst others. So basically what I do is I introduce an energy block, a detailed energy block, both in production and in consumption. Energy is not a high level commodity here. Energy is a combination, so it has quite a little bit of disaggregation going on. Energy is a combination of fuel and electrical energy, with fuel obviously trying to proxy transport, which is still dominated by fossil fuel burning technology. Electrical energy is a nested combination of brown and green. Brown can be either imported from the interconnector, and this takes into consideration the importance of the interconnector in our total electricity supply, or else brown electricity can be produced locally using a combination of capital labor and LNG, which is the type of gas that we use on this island. Green electricity is produced locally, and this is the only type of energy which has no carbon footprint assigned to it. It is a combination of labor and green capital, which is owned and accumulated by household. It basically proxies the solar panels that households have on their rooftops, basically. As I said, energy enters both into in the production side and into consumption side. When it comes to the consumption side, so households consume energy directly, I also allow for asymmetric effects. This is a little bit not standard. This is an added complication, which is in line with a lot of literature that shows how poorer or low-income households are can be significantly more affected by energy shocks due to the fact that they tend to consume more energy in their consumption basket, and this is introduced in the model as well. Most importantly, given the type of study that we're going to show here, all energy prices at retail level can be fully administered with a system of tax and subsidy. So basically I can switch on a system whereby government, through the use of its fiscal, obviously, instruments, can completely isolate the retail energy prices from whatever shocks are happening outside. And this is obviously what's been going on here in Malta, and that's why it's important to introduce this. I will not go through the model in more detail. This is just a bird's eye view, just to give you an idea of how more complex now the model has become with the introduction of the energy block. The energy block is shown in the yellow bubbles there, and this just gives you an idea of how much choices each agent needs to go through in order to combine and to come up with a total energy commodity, which is then used in both production and consumption side. Simulation design here is very important because obviously it's quite a complicated scenario that we are trying to study. What I do here is first I try to calibrate the energy crisis scenario with government aid. So this is basically I do a baseline full subsidy scenario which simulates what has been going on in the economy since 2021 here in Malta. This is a little bit more complicated than it sounds because there are unknown factors that affect the price at which electricity operators and fuel importers can purchase at the price. So the price, there are purchase agreements going on, there are hedging agreements going on, which are of obvious confidential nature, and so it is not easy to calibrate these shocks. So instead of targeting international commodity prices, we target fiscal subsidies. So what I do here is I switch on subsidies, government subsidies, and I simulate and I shock, all brown energy types such that the total government expenditure within the model exactly equates the government expenditure that has been actually done on these subsidies, and this is obviously data which we do have and obviously we can use. Then the second scenario runs the same thing except with government subsidies turned off. So these are two, technically speaking, deterministic simulations. So the government can say upfront what he's going to do. In the first scenario, he commits, similar to what he did, commits to keep on fully subsidizing energy. In the second scenario, it's a hypothetical one, obviously, starts in 2021 and tries to understand what would have happened had the government said, okay, I will not do anything, there will be the normal pass-through that the retail markets decide. Then all counterfactuals are estimated as the difference between these two scenarios. Let's go to the results. Just again to help you understand how to interpret these results. These are deviations from a full subsidy level or percentage point, depending on the variable. But the point here is if we take GDP, in the event of a no government intervention, this chart shows that at its peak, GDP would have been 1.2% in level, lower than a full subsidy scenario. So this is the way in which you can read these charts. Just a word on the transmission mechanism. So basically, as you can expect, there is imperfect substitutability between green and brown energy sources. What does this mean? Basically, when brown energy prices start to increase in a hypothetical no government subsidy scenario, what happens is that economic agents will be tempted to switch to green. Obviously, this cannot happen. Green energy supply cannot match all the brown energy demand that invariably goes down. And what happens, obviously, is that people will need to keep on consuming or using brown energy, which now have higher prices, which leads to overall increase in energy prices. As you can see in the last in the last chart there, in the bottom right, on the bottom right hand side, energy inflation would be expected. So in the event of no government subsidies, would have been expected to increase by 6 percentage points in 2021, peaking to 16 percentage points in 2022. This is energy inflation, not overall inflation. As energy inflation increases, there is a decrease in energy demand. So how economic agents, both households and, more importantly, industry, will try to become more energy efficient. However, you cannot become more energy efficient without hurting a little bit your value added. There is a drop in value added, which leads to a reduction in labor demand and investment. The reduction in labor demand leads to a drop in nominal and real wages. So real wages are hit twofold, both from the nominal side and from the real side, through an increase in inflation, as we will see later on. Despite the reduction in labor costs, marginal costs in the economy do go up. So this is, after all, a negative supply side shock. And you can see that by looking at the bottom left-hand chart, which shows the with the dotted red line showing core inflation. Core inflation, which is a general measure of overheating in the economy, which excludes energy, which is going up, showing that there is, this transmission of this energy price shock also into the non-energy part of the economy. What happens when you have this upward pressure in marginal cost is that you suffer as an open economy on the external side. And as you can see, there is a reduction in exports due to, obviously, an increase in export prices. There would have, so turning on to the domestic now side, negative wealth effects and negative income effects would have driven down private consumption. Relative to a full subsidy scenario. Interestingly, as you can see from the from the second and third charts in the first row, there are more pronounced cuts on the non-recording side. So basically, a non-recording household here is technically, in layman terms, proxies the low-income households, and as you can see, these type of households are forced to cut back on non-energy and total consumption by more than their recording or high-income counterparts. And part of this is due to stronger negative income effects for these non-recording households, and this is driven by a higher inflation, a higher consumer inflation that is faced by these households. If you see the second chart at the bottom, so household-specific inflation, you can see that there is quite a bit of heterogeneity between the inflation, the household-specific inflation faced by recording households, which is around 1%, and the non-recordings, which is around 2%. So basically, I'm saying that non-recordings or the poorer households would have been expected to face almost twice the inflation, the increase in inflation of their recording counterparts. And basically what this means is that apart from the macroeconomic impact that higher energy prices would have had on the economy, there are also important distributional elements that one needs to take into consideration. This second set of results is more energy specific. So basically I am showing more energy specific variables, some GHG estimates. So this is more energy environment related. As I said, higher energy prices lead to a reduction in energy demand. And as you can see in the first chart, it's mostly due to a reduction in energy demand used in production and not in consumption. Energy consumption is a little bit more smooth, and this obviously follows the fact that consumers tend to smoothen their consumption behavior. Energy consumed by households drops by less, as I told you, but if you look at household-specific energy consumption, you can see that non-recordings cut back by less. And this rests on the fact that non-recordings not only, so poorer households, not only have a higher share of energy in their consumption basket, but they are able to shed off this consumption less, because most of this consumption is really a necessity for them to survive, so to say, whereas the higher income households have the luxury to cut back on this consumption without hurting their standard of living too much. Obviously, this implies that recording households are hit twice. Not only they are hit by higher inflation ex ante, but also they are less able to reduce their exposure to this high-priced commodity, which is energy. We've talked about the benefits mainly of this policy, nothing about the costs. However, as you can see from the second set of charts here and at the bottom, there are some costs associated with such a policy. First of all, given the fact that brown energy has been heavily subsidized, this has cut back the incentive of industry and households to invest in greener energy types. And this shows, by looking at the second chart in the second row, share of renewables. The share of renewables in electricity supply would have increased by 1.5 percentage point in the event of no government subsidy. So this is an adjustment which, unfortunately, in a sense, was lost, obviously, because of these subsidies. Moreover, greenhouse gas emissions would have dropped between 4 and 5%. And this is basically mostly due not only to the increase in share of renewables that would have prevailed in the case of a no subsidy scenario, but mostly due to lower energy demand. Finally, there are important implications on fiscal debt, on government debt ratio, and also on the trade balance. As you can see from the first two charts at the bottom row, the impact on the government debt ratio is considerable. First of all, something that I have not said and I skipped, I am not only after results till 2024, so till now, I am simulating these results going forward, and this is based on the premise and on the news and on the commitments by government to continue this type of policy for the foreseeable future. And as you can see, the total cost in terms of government debt to GDP ratio up till 2024 rests at around 4 percentage points. So government debt ratio is now 4 percentage points higher than would have been had the government not enacted this policy, taking in consideration direct and indirect effects. And more importantly, perhaps, if this policy were to continue, even after internalizing the fact that nowadays foreign energy prices are lower than their peaks, much lower than their peaks, but still higher than their pre-COVID levels, it would imply that the government debt ratio by 2030 would have been almost 8 percentage points, would be 8 percentage points higher than in the case of no government subsidy. And this obviously starts to raise questions then about an exit strategy, what about it, how to implement it, and whether to recycle or whether there is the need to recycle any funds that are, so to say, saved from this current policy. Apart from the fiscal side, there are also costs associated on the trade balance side. This is a terms of trade shock, a negative terms of trade shock. Obviously, what is showing here is that the trade balance would have been slightly better without this policy in place, And this is also something to think about when thinking about whether to continue with such a policy or whether to opt for an exit strategy. In conclusion, I will not go through again the results, but my takeaway points here are that the fixed energy pricing strategy propped up aggregate demand, it shielded consumers, mostly poorer households, from negative income effects and helped maintain external competitiveness. However, it has and will be expected to continue to have a significant negative impact on government debt, and also a negative impact on the external indebtedness of the economy due to negative impacts on the trade balance. And what we are doing now is that we are extending the study in light of these conclusions on with policies, with hypothetical exit strategies, different exit strategies, different timings, different fiscal recycling measures, to try to gauge not an optimal, but try to move towards an optimal policy for this very important subject, which we believe has had very important implications on the Maltese economy. That's all from my side. I'm open to questions now. Vanessa.
Hi. No, thank you for the presentation. So I hope I got this correctly, but I have a little bit of a problem with your modeling because it's a price cap, right? It's not a compensation you said before, but then modeling in the way that there is a shock, but at the same time you have a subsidy by the government of the same size. I don't feel like this is really modeling the price cap as such, because basically what's happening is there is just an increase in debt government side and the prices are just constant, right? So maybe you could go
exactly that's what's happening. That is what's
that's what you're modeling.
The subsidies are not given to the households. The subsidies are given to the energy distributors in the model. Okay. So I have energy producers, I have energy distributors. Mm-hmm. The subsidies go there, not to the household side. The household does not see the subsidy.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, they see it, the Ricardians see it, so the forward-looking nature of households will say, okay, this is a subsidy which either me or my sons will have, or my children will have to pay in the future. That is there, but the energy prices at the retail level is zero.
Okay, so it's given to the distributors, and that's why they will not increase any prices. All right, thank you.
Prosit, Noel. I was mostly interested in your finishing comment that you are extending this to look further into the future, because basically this is an all or nothing exercise. Yes. You either have subsidies or you don't have them. And obviously we know that in the years where we had such a big shock, decisions had to be taken urgently, and decisions were taken, and probably the net result of those decisions from your exercise looks quite positive. But going forward with more pragmatism, I think we need to have serious studies to find alternative ways. Basically, I think it's involved switching from price caps to compensation, because price caps apply across the board. Compensation could be more targeted, and it could be adopted in a gradual manner. So I urge you to follow on that and issue these models for an exit strategy, which obviously has its own negatives as well, because obviously I think the government, by removing the price caps, is exposing itself to a sharp increase in inflation. Because obviously the inflation measures only the price increases, doesn't measure the compensation. But it's something which data from your side would help policymakers to take the right policy decisions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your comment. You are right. There is, so I mean, from our studies, from the extension that I'm talking about, we are seeing that there is some pent-up inflation. So if the government were to interrupt subsidies right now abruptly, there are some inflationary pressures. There is some economic cost to it. It's not free. However, I think that there's also an opportunity to it, because as I hinted here, one aspect which we've not seen much improvement in, and also one of these, this policy is also driving for this effect, is that such a policy, I mean, a subsidy scheme in this case, it's very, very distortionary in nature. It has had its, I mean, it has been very, very much a good thing in the peak period. You can see peak impacts of 1.2% in GDP are not small. However, going forward, subsidizing the part of the energy mix which we know needs to go down by other commitments is not necessarily a very valid long-term strategy, let alone looking at the fiscal impact, the trade balance impact, but also the message that one needs to, I mean, that the government, that the policymaker is giving to the rest of the economy. I think that's a little bit not clear.
What I would like to add is on this, clearly the benefits of the subsidy are there when the shock is temporary. I mean, if the shock is permanent, clearly you cannot give the subsidy forever, because as we've seen from the model, the cost of the subsidy is the external account. Ultimately, you're having a higher trade balance, and that means that we either have to run down our external assets, which are not infinite, or you have to be borrowing more from abroad, which has a cost or a price to pay. The shock was clearly temporary. I mean, we've seen the prices shoot very high level for a brief period, and they've come back down, maybe not to the whole way. So there is still a price that we're paying in terms of the terms of trade. The issue is whether, okay, the price cap will not give an incentive to change your behavior, especially for households, to change their behavior, and maybe also firms as well. But, I mean, the issue is that if we do manage to transform the economy in the sense that we generate more export-oriented activity to pay for that price we're paying on the trade balance, then it could be sustained. But you have to basically export more or innovate and gain terms of trade from another sector, so that the country can compensate for the shock in the subsidy. But clearly the subsidy ideally should be for a temporary period and not for to avoid these distortions that
you are right. The trade balance. So without the subsidy, trade balance would have been better, even though exports would have been worse. So I mean, the model is that. No, it internalizes the fact that with higher prices, exports would have been lower. Nonetheless, the trade balance impact is still on the negative side, because what you just said is not happening. It's not very easy to gain the terms of trade that's been lost due to this shock simply through the subsidy. It's not enough.
Yeah, but as long as we still have a positive trade balance, which is the case,
you can
afford it.
Yes,
the country can afford it. The problem starts if that trade balance, that positive trade balance, vanishes.
I think to shed more light on the narrative, of keeping or not keeping the energy subsidies, it would be good to translate that impact on GDP, which may be a rather unemotional sort of number, into the impact at a sectoral level in terms of GVA and on a household cohort level in terms of the low, medium. I think that would drive the message exactly, what are we afraid of if we change, yes or no. So that's one thing. Secondly, one thing which maybe you might consider is a slightly different question is, at which point would it be optimal for the government to have an exit strategy? Now we have the fiscal rules, which under the new system, basically having an expenditure cap means that, say, if you spend X amount, you're okay. But you cannot spend more than X, which means that for any future energy shock, if prices go higher for a longer period of time, that means that the choice is not, okay, yes, have the deficit. The choice is, yes, you can keep your energy subsidies, but you have to cut somewhere else, which means that your choice is not between keeping GDP as is or having a shock, but rather saying, is GDP higher if I keep the energy subsidy and then cut my expenditure somewhere else, or is it higher if I remove the energy subsidy so I can keep the expenditure elsewhere? And I think for policymakers, that would shed some light, and because the question is, for how long can we keep doing this? And the answer is the political commitment, I will keep doing this. But I think the question has to be free. At what price level and duration will it be optimal for the policymaker and say, it is actually better for us to change? Because in that way, I think we'll be speaking to the policymaker in a more effective way. Because as you said, the numbers allow us to keep on this indefinitely, which our hunch suggests that it should not be the case. But the numbers show that it is possible.
Let me clarify the last point. Keeping this indefinitely, I think also the acting governor's comment here was referring to the trade balance. As long as the trade balance is positive, is very positive like ours, we can absorb this, but the fiscal side is not looking, we're talking about 10 percentage points, 8 percentage points by 2030, and the energy price assumptions that we're taking between 2026 and 2030 are fixed energy prices. We know that through the introduction of ETSs, energy directives, most probably brown energy prices will have to increase. If anything, there will be a positive trend, which I'm not taking in consideration here. So I don't believe that we can continue with this indefinitely, at least on the fiscal side. On your point of optimal price, I think it's a political decision, unfortunately. What is the optimal in the sense that when price levels reach that point, we go out. That's very difficult, also because, as I said, there are underlying trends. So it's not a question of whether price level is 80 or 90 or 100. It's a question of why is it 80? Is it 80 because there are ETSs pushing up prices because we need to reduce energy demand? Or is it because there is a strange development in some part of the world which needs to be absorbed? I think that is the decision that needs to be made rather than whether it's a level or not. On your point on whether we can shift the question on keep this but cut somewhere else, I am looking at that, actually. I am looking at keeping this and increasing income taxes, or I don't know. So that kind of trade-offs are being taken in consideration in some way or another in my exercises, yes.
Thanks. No. So yes, I think continuing on this a bit on the EU ETS side, because I think some of the presentations today were precisely on this, no, and just I think you've made clear, no, that the subsidy here is not just on the gas price; it's on everything, also EU ETS, and now EU ETS 2 is coming on board as well at some point in 2027. Would you consider maybe, I don't know, maybe an exercise how much GHGs, let's say, are we not, transforming or lowering because of the fixed energy price policy? Because one thing that's going to happen in Europe is that in 2027, 2028, energy prices might be higher because of the EU ETS scheme. And in our case, we're telling Europe that, okay, we have agreed to this, but we don't care, basically, and we're fixing energy prices.
Yeah, on your point, what are the greenhouse gas cuts that would have happened in case of no government subsidy? There is a chart here. It does not internalize, however, increases in ETSs. As I said, and you can see from the GHGs now, they are stabilizing towards the end of the sample. It's because I am using a naive assumption with no trend in energy prices, which is, I'm being optimistic. I do have, however, a study on how the ETS is on the energy side only, on the energy side. So not maritime, for instance, but on the energy side, how this can impact the economic activity in GHGs. My results tally with most of results of that come out from models similar to this. GHGs cuts are not really big. So basically the consensus with this kind of models, at least, is, and we have confirmed it for Malta as well, is that with the ETS prices foreseen, also talked about by Nathaniel in terms of magnitude of prices, they will have a subdued effect on inflation, a subdued yet a contained but consistent effect, negative effect on outputs, on economic output, but GHGs, it's not being, the model is not affected by it is not estimating a cut which leads us to the 2050 targets. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Other questions? So I think that we can have a coffee break. Thank you, Noel.